Welcome and thank you for watching. So first of all, my name is Silja Leifsdottir and I'm the exhibition curator at Bergen Kunsthall. And just to make sure that we're all in good place, this talk takes place in the context of Iter Subterraneum, the current group exhibition at Bergen Kunsthall. The exhibition takes its point of departure from Ludvig Holberg's Nils Klimt's Journey to the Underground, which is a novel from 1741. A speculative narrative in which a fall through the earth in Bergen opens into a world governed by sentient trees. Rather than treating Holberg's text as a historical curiosity, this exhibition approaches it as a generative lens for thinking with contemporary art about subterranean worlds, vegetal intelligence, and alternative models of coexistence beyond human centrality. The exhibition includes works by Mira Domier, Cecilia Fiona, Robert Gabri, Ingela Irman, Wangechi Mutu, Noor Oyada Ovartachi, Naomi Rincon-Gallardo, Kåre Ruud, and Annika Yi, as well as an historical presentation including the original novel itself, now 285 years old. Across the exhibition, these artists explore underground space not as a site of darkness or retreat, but as an infrastructure, a space of roots, mycelial networks, sedimentation, and slow time, where knowledge is accumulated, transformed, and shared across species. Questions of care and growth and dependency and ecological ethics run through the works, often challenging dominant ideas of agency, authorships, and visibility. And it is within this framework we are very pleased to welcome Giovanni Aloi. Giovanni Aloi's research focuses on the Anthropocene and on new conceptions of nature in art. He's an art historian, curator, and writer, and currently teaches at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He's also the editor-in-chief of Antenna, the Journal of Nature in Visual Culture, an important platform for interdisciplinary work at the intersection of art, ecology, and visual culture, and it has been a source of great inspiration for the exhibition while I was researching it. And in recent years, Aloi's work has focused increasingly on plant life, vegetable agency, and what he describes as plant thinking in contemporary art and philosophy. Aloi's recent publications include Vegetal Entwinements in Philosophy and Art, Estado Vegetal, Performance and Plant Thinking, Botanical Revolutions, How Plant Changed the Course of Art, Lawn, and I'm Not an Artist, Reclaiming Creativity in the Age of Infinite Content. And across these projects, he has been central in shaping critical plant studies as a field that moves between art history, theory, and artistic practice. And alongside his writing and teaching, Giovanni Aloi has contributed to PBS television and BBC radio programs, has previously worked at Whitechapel Gallery and Tate Galleries in London, and is currently the US correspondent of S Magazine. He has curated exhibitions in the US and Europe, and is co-editor of the University of Minnesota Press series Art After Nature. And in today's lecture, Giovanni will speak about critical plant studies and contemporary art through the recent body of works. And so I'm very grateful to have you with us today, and I'm very much looking forward to this talk. So I hereby give the word over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor. Also, thank you for the wonderful introduction. It's one of the best things about what we do is to hear that we inspire each other. So to me, it's very important and precious to hear that some of my work has somewhat helped you to piece together this incredible exhibition. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about critical plant studies and how it has impacted the world of contemporary art, how contemporary artists are turning to plants in order to create new paradigms for us to explore, and how philosophy and science are entwining in incredible ways with art in order to map new territories of the more than human world. Really exciting moment, I think, in the history of contemporary art, but also in just the practical and theoretical ways in which we can expand our conceptions of nature in ways that have not been done before. So it's a great pleasure today to be able to talk to you about my most recent book, Botanical Revolutions, that I am going to take us through relatively quickly. I've given many presentations about this book in the past, but in this case, I wanted to focus more on contemporary art, which in the book happens towards the end. and sort of expand some considerations as well as create some categories that I sketch out in the book, but that I had the opportunity to refine in the context of this presentation and the exhibition that you have put together. So I would like to take us through, just relatively swiftly, the structure of the book and the main chapters that I thought were essential in order for us to get an understanding of why plants matter in the history of art, why they have been sidelined, which of course is one of the biggest issues that I try to tackle with the book, and how all these past histories of art experimentations and moments in which art has really been changed by the impact of plants have led contemporary artists to develop their new contemporary strategies. So the book, in a way, came out of the sense of frustration that, in a way or another, art history still is, and it has been, a thoroughly anthropocentric discipline. And I think when I say that, I'm not surprising anybody. Of course, the problem is that this anthropocentrism has become the unquestioned foundation of art history itself. We don't, um, outside of the conversations of human animal studies and critical plant studies, challenge art history as much as I think we should. And I see this when I go to conferences that are broadly focused on the subject. So I wanted to create a book that's, in a sense, a companion to the traditional art history book. And this book, Botanical Revolutions, emerges from my previous works, some of which you have mentioned in the lovely presentation, and a focus on the intricacies of representation itself. It matters how we represent plants. It matters how we allow them or not to manifest their complexity in ways that don't become shackled by our symbolist and metaphorical needs to impose meaning upon the world. So I think a lot of my research over the past 15 years, especially focusing on plants, stems from this moment in particular, stem from the unease and the importance to understand why the way we represent plants matters. We really need to, as artists, as philosophers, as art historians, to fine tune our strategies, our representational strategies, so that we can better expose, foreground, and amplify the beautiful complexity of plants. So, Botanical Revolutions is structured around 7 chapters. And I tried, for as much as this is also a conflicted maneuver, to follow some kind of chronological order, because of course the official art history book has trained us to look at art through the progressions that of course is fictitious of timelines. But I also treat every chapter as an individual revolution in its own right. It was important for me in the introduction to focus on what anthropocentrism is and how it has miseducated us to relegate nature to a place of irrelevance. This to me is important because it ties representations of all kinds, not just art, to a tendency we have to diminish animals and plants. And in order to put this point across with my students and also with the public during lectures, I use this fresco by Raphael called The School of Athens, which is an imaginary classical architectural setting in which white marble dominates the scene, beautiful central perspective, which, as we know, was a philosophical strategy to position the human point of view at the center of the world. And what strikes me about this incredible work is the absence of animals and plants. In this symposium of great minds, focused around the presence of Aristotle and Plato at the center of the fresco, we witness a number of erasures of race, erasures of gender, and erasures of plants and animals, which are all in a way interconnected. So, the introduction, which focuses on this idea of anthropocentric miseducation, for me is an invitation to look at different cultures in the past, histories, and to understand how plants have figured in different ways across them. Just to give you an idea, in the first chapter called Becoming Plant, which of course is a riff of Deleuze and Guattari's Becoming Animal, I look at how, for instance, in Western culture, we have developed a deeply rooted unease with the notion that humans can turn into plant, but by doing so, for whatever reason, they diminish themselves. So I look at Apollo and Daphne from Ovid's Metamorphoses, and then turn to Aztec cultures and the history of Mayahuel and Axelcoatl, which presents a very different scenario. While in Apollo and Daphne, the transformation of Daphne into a laurel stops completely Apollo's desire, it kills Apollo's desire. In the myth of Mayahuel, her transformation into an agave enriches her personality and identity as a goddess of prosperity. Of course, you can read about the stories more in depth in the book. Right now, I don't have the time to really dive deeply as much as I would like. But I also look at Aboriginal painting in Australia and how plants are seen as part of a continuum between land, animals, peoples, and what in the West we call the landscape. The picture itself is not representational. What Aboriginal artists do is that they narrate stories that are embedded across species and across the soil and time. So I became interested in this notion that in the West, we really tend to separate and hierarchize, while in other cultures, these structures of thought are missing. And of course, it seemed important in chapter 2 to focus on how plants have materially helped us to expand our thinking and sensorial. This is a slight reconfiguration of what most art history books, in a sense, do. Art history books acknowledge the material contribution of plants in the making of art. Of course, they wouldn't be drawing without paper, that wouldn't be painting and pigments without plants. But what art history books don't acknowledge enough, in my opinion, is the fact that, for instance, the invention of papyrus and then the invention of paper in China in 105 did more than just provide materials to us through which we could expand our thinking. It actually expanded the way in which we could narrate and communicate with each other. And in return, it expanded the ability of our brain to link very desperate and very far apart entities in the world. So I think more about not the practicality of materiality, but how plants helped our memory to expand and build upon itself. How plants enabled us to archive, because of the flexibility of vegetal fibers and the durability of vegetal fibers, archive our knowledge and then make it something that can be built upon. And how we could, through the flexibility and malleability of plant fibers, return to that knowledge, therefore really changing the structures of our brains. And I use in this chapter this incredible work by Lu Ping called Landscapes Flower, in which we can see a poem gliding right next to the leaf of an orchid. Everything has been painted with charred pine trees to create the black ink. It has been painted on paper. It is about a plant. The poem itself tries to capture the beauty of the scent of an orchid. And I think what art history has missed, oftentimes focusing on subjects, influence, movements, and periods, that without plans, we would have never been even able to think through some of the big ideas and concepts that art history cherishes so much. I continue this journey in chapter 3, which is titled Words and Images, looking at the relationship between illustration and words on the pages of the first books in the West that set the benchmark for what will become botanical illustration, scientific research, scientific treatises. And I enjoyed noticing how plants, of course, were among the first subjects that pushed our need to represent nature with accuracy. Medicinal plants had to be accurately harvested, and without illustrations, it was impossible to identify them in the field. In this manuscript, we see words sort of like following as close as possible the outline of these plants, as if the two want to really engage and entwine in a new conception of nature. A new conception that then develops, of course, in the West through the work of Gerardo Cibo, who paints plant in botanical treatises like nobody had ever accomplished, with incredible attention to roots and leaves and flowers. I follow the importance as well of the representation of plants as it emerges in China, where bamboo causes major revolutions. First of all, in the work of Guandao Sheng, a female artist who dared to paint bamboo in a way that was revolutionary and only reserved to men, causing therefore a big stir in society. And then the artist Su Shi, who in the 11th century painted bamboo in red, which had never been done before, and was ostracized from the emperor's court for doing so. Again, breaking the rules in the representation of plants can land artists into trouble. I also look at phenomena that are relatively well known, like tulip mania in the Netherlands during the 17th century, and how the obsession with tulips really led to the invention of the aesthetic solution that we do find in botanical illustration. So the white background and the flower extracted from any natural background becomes the um, standard for the representation of flowers, but it has an origin that it's actually linked to the sale of these tulips that became extremely expensive during what's remembered as the first market bubble in the history of the world. Of course, I focus on the still life revolution that during the 17th and 18th century seemingly placed plants at the forefront of art and yet pushed them further in the back. I've talked extensively about this moment in other books and essays. The symbolism that was imposed on these still life paintings completely smothers the ability plants have to say anything about themselves. This is one of the biggest points that I think is important between the difference of what artists do today and what artists used to do in the past. Artists today try not to use plants and flowers as symbols and metaphors of something that is not, in one way or another, related to the plant itself. So, what I'm saying is not that symbolism and metaphors are negative or bad in themselves, is that they need to be used carefully and they need to be deployed with a sense of respect for the plant, the flower, the creature that is being represented. So, in these still life paintings from the 18th century, flowers and plants are purely serving a metaphorical, symbolic purpose that's hinged to Christianity and Christian meanings. So, we are asked to look at these flowers in order to think about virtues that are important to Christianity. That's how we are turning away from the flower. The flower becomes a vehicle to think about something that is wholly human, so we return to an anthropocentric construct. And of course, I could not avoid the important acknowledgement that plants have shaped our world from an architectural and design standpoint. Again, art historians of a classical kind might say, we say this in the art history book. It's like, yes, but not quite in the way that I do in Botanical Revolutions. The art history book always makes plants subservient to the genius of designers and architects who looked at the plant and formally found harmony or solutions that they couldn't find elsewhere. But I think designers and architects actually looked at plants in ways that were much more deeply engaged with the lives of plants themselves. For instance, I came across, this is the only anecdote I can recount from this chapter, there are many in every chapter, but I came across this very interesting story that I didn't know myself. And, I studied art history and architecture in Italy. So you would assume that this is a story that could have come my way. And it's about the most famous leaf in the history of architecture, which is the acanthus leaf. We're all familiar with it. Everywhere we turn in our cities, in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere in the world, when we look at columns, it's very likely that the leaf used in the capital is the acanthus. This is the Corinthian style, the Corinthian order. And as the story goes, the architect who invented the design for the Corinthian capital was called Callimachus. And he was at a cemetery when he noticed nearby a maid placing a basket full of toys on the grave of a young girl that had just passed away. He returned to the cemetery in the spring and noticed that an acanthus plant had grown from under the basket. And so the leaves were embracing the shape of the basket in a beautiful way. The maid had also placed a tile on top of the basket to protect the toys from the elements. And Callimachus had just a eureka moment where he rushed back to the studio and started sculpting the first capital with acanthus plants. And what was interesting and what I didn't know myself is that because of this story, because of the ability of the acanthus to grow from a grave and persist despite the presence of a basket on top of it, the capital itself, the Corinthian capital, represents resurrection, rebirth. And I think it's interesting to note as well that this meaning is what carries the leaf of acanthus in capitals in the East. The acanthus became popular in Southeast Asia, for instance, and was combined to another plant, the lotus, that is very important in Buddhism, which is also about the emergence from hardship and rebirth. So in the book, I try to follow these intricacies and explore how the most meaningful moments in which architects and designers have really done justice to the importance of plants is when they have observed carefully not just the beauty of the leaves, but also the life cycle of the plant itself. In Exposing Vegetality, which is chapter 6, I look at the history of artists who have enriched and developed their lives of research through plants in order to invent astonishing new media like photography. The history of photography could not exist without the contributions of plants, both from a chemical and material perspective, but also as plants were being used very earlier on in order to create the first photograms. Plants, more than other objects or creatures, are easy to flatten. And the analogy between the flatness of the leaf and the flatness of the photographic paper helped early photographers to create incredible masterpieces that allowed them to fine-tune the medium of photography itself. Among the many that have been erased over time is Anna Atkins and her beautiful book made to represent British algae. The one that also included ferns that she did thereafter. And again, this is the first book in the history of of art to be entirely made of photographs. And of course, it was erased and sidelined because it was the work of a woman who was not trained as a photographer professionally and was not trained as a scientist either. And yet, the incredible contribution emerges from her love for plants. She was a botanist first and foremost. In this chapter, I also look at the Lumiere brothers' invention of Kodachrome, the first true original color representation in the photographic medium that captured a truthful rendition of the chromatic spectrum. The medium was made using potato starch. Again, plants being part of the material, the essential material that allows the medium to emerge. But also, this moment was marked by an insistence by the Lumiere brother to photograph flowers and plants in the gardens and indoors, because this is the first photographic medium that will capture the true color of your plants. And in modern plants, from object to subject and beyond, I focus on how plants enabled artists to invent abstraction through Monet, of course, who was a botanist before he was a painter. He loved these plants so dearly. In the garden of Giverny, he hybridized flowers. He was in love with these water lilies. And it's through the water lilies that he really envisions a new painterly dimension of transcendence, where the flowers are no longer just flowers in a botanical sense, but they are actually portals to a different dimension of meditation and existence in harmony with nature. I also turned to Hilma af Klint, an other artist who was a botanist first and foremost, and then develops her own brand of pioneering abstraction by communing with plants, by observing them and perceiving the uniqueness of their being and existence. At the beginning of her career, when she paints botanical illustrations in a traditional style, her approach to plants is more classical. But then, as her journey unfolds, we find these kind of representation, like this representation of a birch. We don't see the plant anymore. We see a transcendental entity. We see a way of being that can simultaneously belong to the plant and belong to us. So we encounter a bridge of colossal proportions that's accomplished in the artistic sphere through the mediation of plant knowledge and plant being. I also couldn't help but put this picture in the book of Matisse sitting happily in his studio with his gigantic monstera, a monstera that informed his very famous collages. And then from this point onward, the book focuses on perhaps the greatest revolutions that take place starting from 1936 all the way to today. And this is where I'm just going to switch gears and talk to you more about modern and contemporary art in the context of these clusters that I also explore in the book. So, one of the questions that's very important to me in the context of which representation modalities are better suited to capturing the complexities of plants in a respectful way, in a way that doesn't smother their being and originality, is of course the question of objectification. This is a question that also pertains to gender and race. And art history has done a great job at addressing those over the decades, especially starting from the 60s and 70s, as we all know. But we have not quite focused as much on the objectification of the more than human world and how that has impacted our conception of nature to the point that so much modern and still contemporary art is anthropocentric in essence. The reason why I want to stress this relentless anthropocentrism that we carry with us in our approach to art is because ultimately climate change and the sixth mass extinction are all connected to our representational strategies. Representation is more than a way to structure a painting or construct an installation or sculpt a work of art. Representation is a philosophical tool through which we think and through which we organize the world. So the way we represent plants ultimately is a manifestation of the way we think about plants. And that representation creates a feedback loop that ultimately naturalizes and reinforces the way we think about plants. That's why representation is so important. And as we know, representation that we see in paintings, sculptures, installations, and museums, although it might seem less impactful than the representations that we see on television, for instance, or in movies or music videos, those representations in museums and art end up infiltrating and informing what we see on the mainstream. So that's why everything matters greatly. So I'm just going to glide through some examples that I thought would be interesting for us. There are many more in the book again. This specifically, this is Edward Steichen's Delphinium, really annoys me because I studied art history in Italy, I studied art history in the United Kingdom for many years, and never did I come across this work. Art history books have completely erased it. And what is it? It's the first exhibition of bio art ever staged. Very quickly, I'm sure you're familiar with this, but for those of you who are not, bioart is art that engages with the living world. And oftentimes it manifests itself with the presence of plants in the gallery space, but more specifically with artists engaging with scientific practices and methodologies involving petri dishes and working in a lab. But in 1936, Edward Steichen, who was very well known as a photographer, brought to MoMA. This is the other thing that really puzzles me. This exhibition didn't happen in a small museum tucked somewhere in the countryside. It was at MoMA in New York, 1936, June 24th, July 1st. He brought to the museum delphiniums in bloom that he had grown himself, hybridized and selected over years to pose a very radical question. What is art? Why is the painting of a flower considered art, but a flower that has been manipulated, engineered by an artist cannot be a flower? Cannot be art? Is it because it will fade, die, and we cannot place it in a collection? Is it because it cannot be purchased by a collector? What is the question here that Steichen is posing? He's also saying, what can plants bring to the game of what we call art so that we can rethink our relationship with art itself? And I think to me, this is a pivotal moment in the history of modern art. It's equivalent to two other moments that are being celebrated in the art history book all the time. Marcel Duchamp's Fountain, collaboration with Baroness Freytag Lorengoven, or John Cage, 4 minutes and 33 seconds. This is exactly the same caliber of radical questioning. And yet, these two works are always considered to be the cornerstones of what gave us contemporary art. And this work doesn't appear in the art history book. So it's my duty was to bring it back in. And then, of course, I look at other appearances of plants that are nonetheless very important, like Joseph Kosuth 1 and 3 plants, in which he staged the photograph of a plant, the plant itself, and the vocabulary definition of a plant to engage in a complex conceptual question related to semiotics, the nature of representation itself, the slippages between different mediatic representations of objects. Many of you will be familiar with the other iteration of this work, which is 1 and 3 chairs, which I'm sure you've all seen in a museum, but he also made a version of the work that entails different plans. And what I was interested in is that curators around the world have staged this work using different plants, and seemingly to them, it doesn't matter which species of plant they choose. So that kind of puzzled me. And it made me think again that despite the foregrounding of the plant in this work, we still find the plant to be objectified it's replaceable. It can be substituted. Another important moment, however, in the history of plants in art, living plants that is Tropicalia by Helio Itisica in 1967, where we find that he brings potted plants to the dismay of curators who at the time didn't know what to do with potted plants because they bring a lot of contamination in the museum through the soil and other parasites. And in this case, what Otisica was doing was putting forward a critique of the perception of Brazil from the Western standpoint as a tropical exotic paradise. And it was essential for him that the plants should be alive. It was underscoring the idea that this is real, right? What he's saying is real. So the real sand, the real pebbles, the real plants. However, we can argue that here too, plants figure in as a metaphor for nature more in general. They are not particularly present to tell us anything about themselves more specifically. So this became my important question throughout my research. Where do we find artists allowing plants to say something about themselves that is not metaphorical, that it's not quintessentially symbolic of other human preoccupation? And I came across, of course, the work of Lucian Freud, who I wrote extensively, about. And this work in particular marks a turning point in the history of Lucian Freud's relationship with plants, which he painted extensively. Again, another history of erasure. In Europe, especially, Lucian Freud is celebrated as the artist who reinvented the nude for the modern age. But he also painted an enormous amount of works with plants in the foreground, and they have been ignored for best part of 50 years until I decided to write a whole book about it, which kind of took the art world as a surprise. It's like, oh, he did paint plants a lot. And he also painted plants like nobody else had done up until that point. Freud had a propensity to paint these house plants, which to me became very interesting. Not just plants in general, but plants that he had lived with for extended periods of time. And to me, this allowed me to rethink my relationship with houseplants, how we become close to our houseplants, and how their shapes, which are always imperfect after a certain amount of time of coexistence, become a co-authored reality. In the dry tips of this yucca, we see many, many months of perhaps neglect or conditions in the domestic sphere that are not ideal with this plant for this plant. And yet the plant endures, the plant perseveres. The plant is not a pet, but it's a kin, a companion that witnesses our everyday lives. And what does it know? What will it never say in its silence of what it sees? Can it perceive something through the humidity and through whatever we exude into the air? There is this cryptic, enigmatic presence that's always with us. And I love how Freud here positioned the plant in the foreground and the human in the background, and how he structured this encounter, which is tense, which is a confrontation of some kind that puts the two on the same level of intensity in the sense of character. And so the question of what is the identity of a plant started to really took hold of me. And I found the work of Li Kuang Ho, who paints cacti in a very hyper-realistic style, making sure that he captures the scars and imperfections. Because like in what Freud did with his yucca, it's in the idiosyncrasies, it's in the flaws, what we would call flaws, that the real identity of a plant resides. It's that moment of lived experience that it's recorded in the trace of a scar that makes this plant unique, that makes this plant impossible to replace with the one that it's on sale at the gardening center. And of course, I focus on the marginalization that artists have tried to process through plants. Zachary Logan, a Canadian artist who focuses on weeds and creates this incredible tableaus in which he explores queerness and the marginalization of queerness as it has happened throughout disciplines and also through life, by capturing the resilience of weeds. So, in the context of marginalization and artists turning to plants, we have really seen a strong focus on weeds for this very reason. Weeds are unwanted, weeds are considered ugly, weeds don't comply with the prescriptions of a capitalist and consumerist system of oppression that wants them to stay put. And I think that that's why artists find them extremely appealing. They work almost as an emblem of what queer communities endure throughout their lives. But here too, I want to point out that they never become passive symbols that speak of something that it's not related to them. Artists use weeds, use is a bad word, engage with weeds in a way that pays respect and homage to them, their resilience, their identity, their diversity, and their ability to survive. And therefore, by observing weeds and by extracting from weeds the lesson, the wisdom that we can make our own. Jean Lee is a Chicago photographer who photographs weeds in Chicago's alleys. These are streets where nobody cares about any weed that grows in the crevices of the asphalt, and yet they endure, like some of the population of Chicago that is pushed to the margin, that it's given nothing to thrive, and yet still endures and perseveres. We also find a very important thread in this interest in weeds, focusing on nativism, because of course not all weeds are native, but many native plants, through colonialist approaches to botany, have been classified as weeds in very problematic ways. Linda Tagg, Baracco, and Wright architects brought to the Venice Biennale of Architecture in 2018 Repair, which is an indoor garden of native Australian plants, which, of course, as you know, have been eradicated by settlers in order to make room for Western culture, Western botany, and cultivar species. What does it mean to bring these plants into the exhibiting space? What does it mean to mobilize a set of metaphors through the living to remind us of what once was? Mona Karen makes incredible murals of native species that were and still are important to indigenous cultures, like in this case, Joe Pye. We're in Jersey here. This beautiful mural is visible from the southern tip of Manhattan. And Joe Pye was an important plant for indigenous cultures that's been eradicated, and now it's coming back into gardens because of its beauty and its healing qualities. So in a sense, Mona Karen tries to bring indigeneity to the forefront through the plants that held indigenous cultures and ideas together. Her representations are scientific. Of course, they're stylized and mildly beautified, but they also work as educational reference points. And in the context of indigeneity and nativism, we also find a strong interest in diasporas across artists. Lois Wayne Berger in 1997 pioneered this topic with the work What is Beyond Plants is at One with Them, where he installed these weeds in an abandoned tract in a train station, looking at the complexities of cultural realities in which people migrate constantly in opposition to the fixity of concepts of national identity and belonging that we still impose upon ourselves today. The location, the train station, is emblematic in this place. Of course, it's a site where plants once existed. It's a site where plants have been removed, and it's a site where comings and goings generate the cross-cultural pollinations that make our reality what it is. Maria Teresa Alves, with her Seeds of Change, focusing on ballast seeds that were transported from Africa to the United States and South America, creating these cross pollinations that oftentimes have been overlooked by the history of botany as well as the history of art itself. And Autobonkanga with their performance Diaspore, which again focuses on the challenges that migrants carry with them when they arrive somewhere and find themselves navigating new territories. In this performance called Diaspore, women of African descent carry pots on their heads containing night blooming jasmine. Night blooming jasmine is a very special plant. Here again, you see how the artist is not just grabbing one plant to represent nature more in general, but she wanted this specific plant because it's a misunderstood plant that originated in the West. It's native of the West Indies, and it has become a cultivar. So it was taken places like natives of Africa were taken places against their will, where this plant was used as an ornamental, then ended up becoming an invasive. It's appreciated and loathed, and at the same time, it's considered an invasive species that needs to be eradicated in places. So you see this ambivalence, cultural references, and it's not a jasmine. That's one of the interesting parts of the history of this plant. It's actually related to potatoes. So it's, again, an identity question that we see here unfolding and unraveling in this incredible work where women dance and sing songs, trying to map new territories, understand where they belong and where they might not belong, where they might find a dancer to engage with who's going to be a good partner, and where they might not. Another incredible artist working in contemporary art with plants is Eddie Rodolfo Aparicio, who has engaged with the history of diasporas that are currently marking the city of LA. He focused on two trees that are very well known in LA, the ceiba trees that has this very pronounced spines, very iconic, and the ficus tree. These trees were imported to California and especially LA during the 1950s and 60s to shade the city because they grow fast and they're very resilient. But now they've started to crack the sidewalks because their roots are also very strong, and the city has begun their systematic removal, especially from neighborhoods of Southern American descent. And what Eddie Rodolfo Aparicio does is that he casts the bark of these trees that have been condemned to be cut with the rubber that is extracted from the para rubber tree, which is native of El Salvador, where his father was born. So he traces his own history of immigration using this material that records the traces of the bark of the trees from Central America and South America that now, like the workers who were taken to the United States to build the United States, are being rejected and expelled from the very cities they built. And you can see how the artist combines textiles that belong to these communities as well that have been discarded. So a play of surfaces, traces, lived lives, but also a manifestation of truth. And again, cosmologies is another interesting area, I think, where artists are really dwelling with the complexities. What I love, I think, about the way artists are engaging with plants is that the purism that we saw emerging at times around 10 years ago, where artists looked at plants as remediators of our fraught relationships with each other and nature itself are now much more shifting towards a register of acknowledgement, embracing, and staying with the trouble, as Donna Haraway perhaps would have it. And in these cosmologies, weeds and cultivars coexist at the same time under the same cultural umbrella. In Precious Okoyomans to See the Earth Before the End of the World, which closed the installations at the Venice Biennale of Art of 2022, we find kudzu and sugarcane entwined with each other. Again, these are plants that were taken to the Americas against their will to remedy something or to bring prosperity. And they have overrun areas of the countryside where they are now seen as invasive, undesirable. So you see here how, again, the metaphorical register is deeply embedded with the history of these plants and our histories as well. Rashid Johnson takes this concern with how plants help us to understand our identity as people who have moved and have been moved around the world on a more personal register as he creates these incredible structures comprising potted plants and sculptures made of shea butter as well as shaving of black soap. As an African American artist born in Chicago who had not visited Africa during his youth, Rashid Johnson started to wonder, how can I connect to a continent so far away that it's so important to my identity and that I've yet been so far removed from? He then realized that any cream, any cosmetic we put on our body is made with shea butter and or black soap, which are derived from African trees. So he realized that for as far as he was all along from Africa, he spent every morning in close contact with African plants. And what is more original, what is more true than the plant that grows out of the ground of the world that you have not been able to experience? So we find, again, these deep considerations and conceptions unraveling into new biographical accounts, sometimes into new historiographies or anthropological approaches that merge and blend together. Cecilia Vicuña has turned to the quipu, this ancestral system of communication and historical indigenous archival um, repository, where she is basically bringing together the memory of forests that have been cut, using the quipu as a way of recording their once upon a time important role after they've been destroyed to make room for cattle ranching and all sorts of capitalist activities that destroy forests. The idea of this brain forest quipu that was exhibited at Tate in 2022 is to celebrate the way in which trees communicate with each other, but also the way in which we are part of that communication, how indigenous people are deeply enmeshed in that register of communication. So in a sense, our work is also reminiscent of Eduardo Kahn's idea that he expresses in the book, How Forests Think. And perhaps more grounded in Western scientific traditions and observation is Diana Scherer's works with roots and plant roots, where she explores the way roots are able to follow specific trajectories in order to find food, and expands, therefore, the Darwinian notion that plants think with their roots. Of course, something that we know has been now challenged, as plants think with their whole bodies. This idea was explored by Celeste Beaussier-Munginot at the Venice Biennale of 2015, where he fit these Scotch pines with a base that was computerized and allowed them to move around the exhibiting space so that the trees could find the quintessential best possible position to thrive. Again, what if trees could move? We tend to think that they are not intelligent because we just see their stillness as a sign that they are not processing, that they're not making decisions, that they're not able to interfere or interlace themselves in the world in ways that surpass our perception, the static perception that we have of them. And I have to say, it was particularly uncanny to see these trees move around the exhibiting space. And lastly, Spela Petric has been working quite interestingly, I think, with the notion of play. Do plants play? We are now slowly coming to grips with the idea that animals of all kinds play, not just cats and dogs, and that play is an important way of being in the world in the sense that we can experiment, we can prod the boundaries of ourselves and reality by playing. So, in this case, in play, Spela Petric has created an environment where plants and an artificial intelligence system are spending time with each other, playing and educating each other. So the plant is creating the environment and the inputs that this AI system will know. So a purely AI plant focused system. And the plant is responding to the stimuli that are sent back by the AI system. So creating these circularities to explore the possibility of plant awareness and possibilities that plants might be engaging directly with the world in ways that we might not perceive otherwise. Of course, sustainability is also important in the context of the research of critical plant studies and artists. A quick mention to Newton Harrison and Helen Mayer Harrison, who pioneered works like the Portable Orchard in 72, 73, where they helped plants thrive in a closed environment, testing early grow lights to see if we could wood plants survive in a post-apocalyptic world. And Francis Whitehead here in Chicago, who used plants for um, cleaning the soil itself. Phytoremediation is very important across artists. Certain species of plants can regenerate the soil if harvested in a way that it's safe and appropriate, and at the same time educate us about our land, our environment, and create a sense of ownership and belonging. Perhaps linked in a different way to the work of Cease Weiss, who in Canada as an Indigenous artist brings people together, growing plants that sustain community and build communities. So gardening as well, taking center stage in the context of plants in contemporary art right now. And with that, I think I've covered quite a few areas, and I hope that this is useful to all of you who are watching.
Wow, this is definitely my kind of art history lesson. Can we do this weekly?
Of course. There'll be plenty, chapter by chapter.
Wonderful. I know there's plenty, so I hope everyone that's been watching does some Google searching and can find all the things. And also, if you're watching, but also based in Bergen, I can say that the bookshop at Bergen Kunsthall, that we also have several antenna magazines and several of the books that you've been helping us to go through. This was really generous and thoughtful and slow so everyone can follow, including myself. Thank you so much for this super interesting walkthrough. I would like to, just to close off, I'd like to sort of see if I can ask a few questions that goes to the core ideas of some of your recent work. The first one maybe more sort of goes directly into one of your recent books where you describe this plant blindness as a cultural condition shaped by art history and colonialism and human exceptionalism. Do you feel contemporary art is beginning to overcome this blindness, or are we simply encountering like new versions of it? Can you see some kind of like, I know since you've sort of also been going so much all the way back, but yeah, do you see sort of some kind of the larger picture when working with this over so many years?
Very interesting question. So, the concept of plant blindness was theorized by two botanists in 1999, Wondersee and Schlosser. And I think it really, despite the fact that it was theorized to explain why children can't name 10 plants, although they might be able to name 10 animals, you can see the application of that theory to our disciplines and also to the way in which more readily we deal with nature in political terms as well as ecological terms. And in the context of art itself, I think your question is really interesting because I have tried as much as possible in my book to focus on artists who truly engage with plants, looking at the lives of plants before they begin to craft their ideas. So it's not the plant is not an afterthought. The plant is not an add-on to add interest to what they do. The plant is a being they think with in order to craft new artworks and to map new territories. Those are the artists which I have showed today who I think are truly overcoming plant blindness because they are, in fact, spending time looking at plants before they begin to put together their pieces. They listen to them. However, there's been a lot of artists who have literally just drawn in a plant because it became fashionable, it became easy to do. And I think my biggest fear and complication lies with curators. I'm a freelance curator and I've curated exhibitions on the topics that I know. And I know that with curators comes a challenge. Curators have to work on so many different topics. And oftentimes they don't have the time to educate themselves enough about the subject that they need to tackle for an exhibition. So I've seen exhibitions where plants were the subject, and the promise was that we would encounter plants from a new perspective, a perspective that's been devised through the lens of critical plant studies, but then the result is not what it is. And I very much appreciate that your approach is very informed by the research and the studying. And I think it's a great example of how it should be done, how our new engagement with plants should unfold. I don't want to mention exhibitions that have just used a different route that's still intrinsically anthropocentric. There is one that's around still right now that makes my eyes cross because I can see that there hasn't been an assimilation of the ideas that we are discussing in the making of the exhibition, and that's visible in the choice of artists and in the curatorial texts. And it's a missed opportunity. It's a setback. It's confusing, I think, the audience who might just be dipping their toes in. So it's important, I think, to be accessible. It's important to be engaging, but it's also important to do justice to the real core idea we're trying to develop now, which is to eradicate plant blindness.
Mhm. Yeah, that was actually also very much a bridge that you kind of answered the next question, which was as this plant life becomes more visible in exhibitions these days, it also risks being aestheticized and instrumentalized, of course. And I was actually what kind of responsibilities and risks do institutions take on when working with plant life today? Which was also an egocentrical questions, of course, from my point of view. But yeah, so I can kind of almost answer the question myself, which is time, because it
Yes.
just you talk about respect and respectfulness also a lot when working with plants, and I think that also only comes with the time
Mhm.
that it takes to actually do the research, which is a privilege, and that you mentioned in the fastness and efficiency net that we're living, you don't necessarily have that privilege to work and
Correct,
spend time.
yes.
But I did have 3 years on this exhibition, and that makes a difference, which I think is important actually to mention to everyone, that time makes a big difference, and you can see and feel the difference as
Yeah,
an audience.
absolutely,
Um,
and I think plants also invite that, one of the interesting ideas that I think has emerged over the past decade is the idea that we all know that plants live on a different time scale, but how can we attune ourselves with that time scale? What can we learn from their being in time? Is also not just a flight of fancy. And of course, our lives drag us places at different speeds that are not plant like. But if we can carve out moments in our lives to look at plants and to be with them and to share, at least find this bridge between us and them on a kind of time basis, something happens, and that something can impact our work. It definitely impacts my writing. I think plants are
mm,
central to my writing. I oftentimes write about plants, so it's a nice combination. But even when I don't write about plants, it is important for me to think about the time it takes for the text to grow. Rushing writing is never a good recipe, and I always become very nervous when, for whatever reason, an institution imposes on me like a very tight turnaround. It's like it's not how I work. It's not. I don't like to work that way because I see also how plants grow. And
yeah.
why there is a certain beauty in what they do. It's because it's not rushed. It's because it's not forced in a way that um, exceeds the the time constraints that govern their lives.
Mm. Yeah, and as we've been sitting here, some watchers' time has passed, and we are on different time zones. So now behind me it's completely black.
Right.
But I have one last. It's a big one, and
Mm.
we'll see. But yeah, we're sort of speaking at a moment where land and territory and natural resources, including the Arctic and subarctic regions, are again framed in blunt, extractive terms tied to ownership and control. And I think this question comes, of course, from just situating it today as well, because the last couple of days has been hard to focus, because Donald Trump has texted our prime minister that he was a bit grumpy because he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, so he wants to buy Greenland. And I hope no one tells him about the seed vault that exists in Svalbard. So we should keep that a secret from him. But I think this question sort of popped into my head because of this extreme 48 hours, making everyone here a bit scared of many things. But what can thinking with plants and with vegetable time and root nets and interdependence offer as a counterpoint to these logics of domination and possession? It's a big one.
Yes, it is. Also because plants act in many, many ways, and I find that there has been a tendency over the past 5 years, especially, as I mentioned in the lecture, to want plants to suggest models that we
Mm,
might lift from them and use as they are in order to live better with each other and build better societies. And I think that there's an element of possibility in that. We definitely learn. We can learn if we want to from animals, plants, and the soil. But that's not to say that any lesson can be lifted from the vegetal world and applied to us in order to lead better lives or fairer lives. As a gardener, I spent a lot of time in the garden. I know that some plants, you see, that's the trick. Not all plants, but some plants act in ways that we, from a human perspective, would consider inappropriate, unkind, parasitistic, and just opportunistic. And the question then becomes about our ethics and morals and whether they fit. Could they possibly ever fit on plant life? Or whether that too is a form of violence that we're operating where we want to see ourselves once again reflected in plants, or we're asking plants something that they cannot provide as an answer. But there are aspects in which plants do inspire us to lead better lives. There are plants that practice symbiosis and solidarity. There are plants that are emblems of endurance and resilience. So I find that extremely inspiring in my life, in my everyday life. There are plants that do exist as part of communities that support each other. So the models can be there. I think the important thing is not to generalize a benign world of, plant kingdom, let's say, that isn't uncorrupted by greed and the desire to smother and colonize, because in a sense it casts us in a distorted way. Animals care about private property, like animals can be very territorial. They have their nest and they don't want other animals to get into it. They have a territory and they'll chase everyone else out of it. Some animals are very territorial, others are not. Some animals will kill who gets into their territories. Other will just push out, the intruder in ways that don't entail killing. And plants do the same. Some plants will smother other plants indiscriminately to get to the sun and use them as a support, to climb closer to the sky. And I think there's a risk and a promise there. But I wonder too if some of our politicians are acting like some plants, and if in good and bad ways. And I wonder there what we are to do with that consideration. And which plant is then Donald Trump?
Thank you. That feels like a very good place to end.
Mm-hmm.
Unanswered, and to everyone watching, draw the plant you think Donald Trump is.
Right. That's a task.
Yeah.
But then
Send
you
it
have
in.
to
It's a
exhibit the
task.
results. I need the commitment from you. You have to have an exhibition with the results, even if it's an online one.
Okay. Yeah, that's okay. Agreed. Yes. Okay,
Wonderful.
fantastic. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Giovanni.
Thank you. Really appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
And congratulations again on the exhibition.
Thank you. Yeah.